In this video, we're going to be looking at the principles of classification and biodiversity. So the first important thing to know is that what classification means. So classification is the idea that we place organisms into groups. And we place them into smaller groups within larger groups. And we call that a hierarchy. It means that you start with a large group. For example, I don't know, we all live in this universe, and then within that, we all live on Earth. That's a smaller group, obviously. And then within Earth, which continent we live on, within which continent, which country, within the country, which town, within the town, which suburb, and within the suburb, which street, within the street, which house, and so on. So we've got this hierarchy from a massive group at the top to smaller groups, and you cannot belong to more than one group at the same level. So if you live in North America, you can't be living in Europe at the same time. It's not physically possible. So place organisms into smaller groups within large groups based on two things. We base them on their characteristics, so things like their anatomy and biochemistry, and their evolutionary relationships. Okay, so we don't just put, all organisms which have wings into a group. You don't put your butterflies in with your birds, because you're also looking at the evolutionary relationship. So it's a combination of the two. Now, in terms of classification, you learned this at GCSE, and it goes in the same order as before. So first of all, we have the domain. Those are the largest, and there are 3 domains that we know from GCSE. So we've got our eukaryotes, our prokaryotes, and our archaea, which are our true bacteria. We then got our kingdoms. You don't need to know all the kingdoms, but I would expect you to know animals, plants, and fungi. Then we've got the phylum. We split that up further. And the class, order, family, genus, and then right down at the bottom, we've got the species. So obviously, if organisms, for example, belong to the same genus as another organism, then they will have to also belong to the same family, order, phylum, class, kingdom, and domain. Okay, so for example, if you look at man, Homo sapiens, what's important to know is when you look at binomial naming, the first name, which is in capital letters, is the genus, and the second name, which is in lowercase, is the species. So if we look at other forms of man that we believe existed, we've got Homo erectus, we've got Homo habilis. We were all of the same genus, which means we all belong to the same family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain, but we are all different species, okay? Which means that we would not be able to mate with each other and produce fertile young. Okay, so whenever you're given the name of an organism, you can straight away work out its genus and species. So for example, Panthera pardus belongs to the genus Panthera and the species Pardus. Okay, this is called the binomial naming of species, bi meaning two, and it's really important because it is universal. That means that somebody in France can talk to someone in China. They don't both have to talk the same language. As long as they're talking in scientific language, they know they're talking about exactly the same organism. You do not need to be able to classify any organisms. You are expected to know the animal and plant kingdom, and you are expected to take this and be able to fill in the genus and the species. We can then look at that, and we can look for evolutionary relationships as well. So for example, if you have 3 organisms, okay, and 2 of them have the same genus. So if we have Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, and we were comparing us to Canis lupus, which is the wolf, then because they both have the same genus, that means they are more closely related, which means they have a more recent common ancestor. And you can see this when you look at what we call a phylogenetic tree. So I might have a phylogenetic tree can go in either direction. I'm going to go sideways, which means that I'm going to start there. So I've got an organism there, and then it splits up further, splits up further again. Go all the way like that. And then I've got organism down here and there. Okay, and we'll call them A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, and time is going in that direction. Okay, so if we look at organism B and C, they have a common ancestor over here. So organisms B and C are more closely related to each other than they are to A, because the common ancestor with A is all the way back there. But A and C, or A and B, are more closely related to each other than A is with D, because if you look at A and D, their most recent common ancestor was always back there. So always think about, when was the common ancestor? Was it recent or was it distant? And what has diverged off since? So yes, A and D and E, they had a common ancestor, but it was quite a long time ago. Whereas A and C had a more recent common ancestor. So therefore, they're more closely related to each other. Now, when we're thinking about organisms, when we're thinking about species, etc., we need to consider the genetic diversity. So what do we mean by genetic diversity? So we've come across this when we were doing natural selection. The genetic diversity is the variation in alleles in a population. And you can examine genetic diversity in a variety of ways. So first of all, you can look at common features. But that might not help you very much, but you can start that way. You can then look at amino acid sequencing. And you would normally choose something that was universal, for example, cytochrome C, which is found in respiration. It's a protein used in respiration. It's found in all organisms, all eukaryote organisms. So it's quite useful to look at amino acid sequences of that, because you can compare pretty much any eukaryote. Obviously, you can't compare a prokaryote, but you know it's hard to find a protein that's universal in everything. Now, the problem with amino acid sequences is we know that the genetic code is degenerate, which means that there could be changes to the base sequence that wouldn't affect the amino acid sequence. So I might see that organisms have exactly the same amino acid sequence as each other. So let's say I've got organism A and organism B, and I compare them, and they've got leucine, arginine, and valine. And that one's got leucine, arginine, and threonine. And organism C has got leucine, arginine, and valine. So what does this tell me? It tells me that A and C are similar and more closely related because they have their amino acid sequences are 3 out of 3 the same, whereas B obviously has one difference. If I had another organism D and I had leucine, valine, leucine again, then I know that organism D is the least related because it's got 2 out of 3 differences. It doesn't tell me much about the relationship between A and C because their amino acid sequences are the same. So I think, well, you know what? I'm going to step one step further back. So instead of looking at their amino acid sequences, I'll look at their mRNA-based sequences. That will tell me a little bit more information because I might now find that there are differences in the actual bases, even though they're coding for the same amino acid. The third base in the codon might be different, for example, but I could still get a situation where those were identical. And so I'm going to go back and look at the DNA-based sequences because that includes all of the introns that were spliced out. So I can see whether those are the same as each other. And that might allow me to distinguish between different species. It might allow me to determine whether species are related to each other or whether organisms belong within the same species. So if we look at species specifically, obviously species are going to have very similar DNA-based sequences. We know that they can breed and produce fertile young. We also know, and this is really important, that a lot of them, although not all of them, display courtship behavior. Now, courtship behavior could be songs, it could be dances, okay, it could be all sorts of things. The idea with important bits of courtship behavior is that it identifies the same species, so that an organism knows that it is actually mating with the same species, and it also synchronizes the mating time so that an organism is aware that the other organism is available and ready to mate. So they're not wasting time trying to mate with someone who is actually not available to mate. Okay, and it's also a chance for particularly males to demonstrate the idea that they have sort of good alleles. So it's demonstrating their mating potential. So we know that a lot of females will be attracted to the bright colours or organisms that can do a particular dance, etc. So it's a chance for males to do that. Okay, and it's only by having the different courtship behaviours that it allows organisms to actually continue to reproduce and produce offspring that can be brought up in the form of possibly by individuals or sometimes by a group. So the last thing for us to think about within this unit is the concept just generally of biodiversity. Now we know that includes genetic diversity, but I'm looking here at the variety of organisms living in a community. So a community is all the different species that you've got. So there's 2 things we need to know for biodiversity, to measure biodiversity. We need to know the number of species, and we need to know the number of individuals in each species. And then we can use that to calculate an index of diversity. And the normal one is Simpson's index, but there are other forms of index. Now I'm going to give you an example to lead you through how we do it. So let's imagine we have a table and we have species A, B, C, and D, and we have the number of them. So we've got 40 of A, 2 of B, 10 of C, and 30 of D. Now, we're going to use a formula. You're normally given the formula. The formula is n times n minus 1 over the sum of small n times small n minus 1. Now, n, big N, is the total number of organisms, which in this particular case is 40 plus 10 plus 30 plus 2. So that's 82. Okay, so we know straight away that our first number is going to be 82 times 81. We then need small n. Small n is the number in each species. So in other words, it's this number over here. That is small n. So what I want you to do when you do these is to have another column where you do small n times small n minus 1. So 40 times 39, 2 times 1, 10 times 9, 30 times 20. Okay, so if we do 40 times 39, we get 1,560. That's 2, that's 90, and that is 600. Add them all up. Gives us 2,252. And that's the number that goes underneath over here. Put that into our calculator. And we get 2.95. And the bigger the number, the more diverse the area is. So what affects biodiversity? Well, what affects biodiversity the most are things like farming. Okay, so for example, if you have farming, you might have something which we call a monoculture, which is one crop. If you use pesticides, you're going to kill animal species. If you use fertilizers, they might kill species in the water when they wash into the rivers and streams. Okay, you might do deforestation, which means you're going to kill plant species. Now, in all of these, what I want you to think about is variety. So, for example, let's imagine we have monoculture. Why is that important? Well, that does a couple of things. You've got less variety. The variety is a really important word of plant species. You will have less variety of habitats because you've only got a monoculture. You'll have less variety, getting the clue of variety, of food sources, which leads you to less variety of animals. It's the same with deforestation. Same principle goes all the way through. Okay, so when you're thinking about describing the effects of farming and other things on biodiversity, think about the plant species, the habitats, the food sources, and the animals, but always think about variety. It's not about mounts, because you could have the same habitat 10 times. That doesn't help you. You need lots of different habitats, lots of different food sources, so that you can have lots of different animals.